I stood frozen in the elegant consultation room at Riverside Manor, watching my mother, Linda, march up to the venue coordinator like she owned the place. The mahogany desk gleamed under soft chandelier light, and through tall windows, I could see the Colorado mountains where Jake and I had dreamed of exchanging vows. My hands trembled as Mom slammed her designer purse on the polished surface. "We're canceling this venue," she announced to Amanda, the coordinator. "She can't afford it anyway." Dad stepped forward, waving his platinum credit card. "We demand a full refund immediately." I watched silently, my throat tight with humiliation. Other couples in the lobby could hear every word. Just then, the office phone rang. Amanda answered hesitantly. "About the property sale last month?" came a voice from the receiver. Mom's phone started ringing. 6 months earlier, everything had been perfect. I remember the exact moment Jake Sullivan got down on one knee in his auto repair garage, grease still under his fingernails from a long day's work. The diamond wasn't huge, but it caught the fluorescent lights beautifully as he asked me to be his wife. Jake was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. He owned Sullivan's Auto Services, a small but thriving garage he'd built from nothing after his parents died in a car accident when he was 19. While working 3 jobs to keep his younger sister Sarah in college, he saved every penny to start his business. His calloused hands told stories of hard work and determination that made my heart race. My parents' reaction was immediate and brutal. Linda, a corporate lawyer at Denver's most prestigious firm, took one look at Jake's work clothes and curled her lip in disgust. Roger, an investment banker whose clients included half of Colorado's wealthiest families, actually laughed when Jake mentioned he hadn't gone to college. A mechanic, Mom had said, as if Jake worked in sewage treatment. "Christy, you have a master's degree in marketing. You could marry someone with actual prospects." Dad was worse. He pulled me aside after that first dinner and said, "This is what happens when you work for nonprofits instead of real companies. You start thinking blue collar is acceptable." But I loved Jake's authenticity. While my parents lived in their gated community bubble, Jake understood real people's struggles. He fixed cars for single mothers, gave veterans discounts, and never overcharged elderly customers. He was more genuine than anyone in my parents' social circle. The sabotage started subtly. Mom would call wedding vendors after I met with them, asking probing questions about payment schedules and contract terms. She'd introduce herself as my mother and express concerns about whether young people today understood financial commitments. Dad was more direct. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, lecturing me about wedding costs while examining my mail and asking intrusive questions about my savings account. He'd make comments about how Jake's garage probably struggled during economic downturns and how mechanics' income was unreliable. I'd saved $12,000 over 2 years specifically for my wedding. Every coffee I skipped, every weekend I worked overtime at the Denver Children's Foundation. Every vacation I postponed went toward creating one perfect day at Riverside Manor. The historic estate with its mountain views and rose gardens was exactly what I'd dreamed of since childhood. But my parents insisted on being present for every vendor meeting. They claimed they wanted to help, but their real purpose became clear when they'd interrupt my conversations with photographers and florists to ask about their policies for canceled bookings. "Just checking," Mom would say sweetly. "Young couples change their minds so often." Jake's family background became their favorite weapon. They'd bring up his parents' accident in conversations with my friends, always with fake sympathy that barely concealed their satisfaction. They'd mention how his sister was still paying off student loans and how tragedy often creates unrealistic expectations about family. The worst part was how they researched Jake behind my back. I discovered Mom had visited his garage pretending to need car repairs while actually gathering intelligence about his business practices. Dad had asked around their country club about property values in Jake's neighborhood, making snide comments about mixed income areas. Now standing in Amanda's office while my parents tried to destroy my wedding day, I realized their manipulation had reached its climax. They weren't just disapproving anymore. They were actively sabotaging my happiness. "This venue is completely inappropriate," Mom told Amanda, her voice carrying across the elegant room. "We've reviewed their finances, and this expenditure would be financially irresponsible." Roger nodded gravely. "We're looking for something more suitable to their actual budget. Perhaps a restaurant banquet room or church fellowship hall?" My cheeks burned with shame. Amanda looked uncomfortable, clearly caught between professional courtesy and family drama she hadn't expected to witness. Other engaged couples in the lobby were staring, and I wanted to disappear entirely. The phone call continued in the background. I caught fragments about contract violations and legal obligations, but Amanda kept her voice low as she took notes. "I appreciate your concern," Amanda said carefully, "but the booking was made by your daughter, and she's provided appropriate deposits according to our payment schedule." "Which will be stopping immediately," Dad announced. "Any future payments will be canceled, and we expect full restitution of amounts already paid." I found my voice at last. "Mom, Dad, please stop. This is humiliating." "What's humiliating?" Linda snapped, "is watching our daughter make a financial mistake that will impact her for years. Marriage is about practical decisions, not fairy tale fantasies." The mysterious phone call was growing more intense. Amanda's expression shifted from professional discomfort to genuine concern as she listened to whoever was on the other end. Amanda stepped away to take the call privately, leaving me alone with my parents in the consultation room, filled with wedding portfolios and fresh flowers. The afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows should have felt romantic, but instead it highlighted the tension crackling between us. Mom reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. My stomach dropped when I recognized the bank logos on the papers inside. "We know exactly what you can afford," Linda said, spreading printed bank statements across Amanda's desk. "These are your financial records from the past 2 years." My blood turned to ice. Those were my personal banking statements from First Colorado Credit Union, showing every deposit withdrawal and balance from my checking and savings accounts, information that should have been completely private. "How did you get these?" I whispered, staring at transaction details that included my grocery purchases, utility payments, and the monthly transfers I'd been making to my wedding savings account. Roger leaned back in his chair with smug satisfaction. "Remember that joint savings account we opened when you were 17 for your college fund? You never formally removed our access when you turned 18. The realization hit like a physical blow. For over 10 years, my parents had been monitoring my financial life through an old account I'd forgotten existed. They knew about every dollar I earned at the Denver Children's Foundation, every expense, every financial decision. You've been spying on me." My voice cracked with betrayal. "We prefer the term staying informed," Mom said coolly, "and what we've learned is deeply concerning. You make $38,000 annually at that nonprofit. Your monthly expenses are approximately $3,000, and you've somehow convinced yourself you can afford a wedding that costs more than half your yearly salary." She pulled out a calculator and began running numbers with practiced efficiency. Venue rental $8,000, catering $6,000, photography $2,000. Flowers, music dress rings. You're looking at $25,000 minimum for one day, Christy. That's financially reckless. Dad nodded gravely. "We've seen too many young couples destroy their futures with elaborate wedding debt. We're trying to protect you from yourself." But there was something darker in their invasion of privacy. As I flipped through the statements, I realized they'd been tracking patterns in my spending. They knew when I'd gone apartment hunting 2 years ago. They knew about every date Jake and I had been on. They knew about the surprise weekend trip I'd planned for his birthday. "You've been watching my entire life," I said, the violation sinking in deeper. "Every purchase, every decision, every private moment." "We're your parents," Linda replied matter-of-factly. "It's our responsibility to ensure you're making sound choices." Then she pulled out another folder and my heart sank further. This one contained documents I definitely hadn't authorized anyone to access. "We also commissioned a background check on your fiancé," Roger announced. "Harrison Private Investigations provides very thorough reports." The folder contained Jake's credit report showing his business loan payments and credit score. There were copies of his lease agreement utility bills and even receipts from his parts suppliers. They'd investigated him like a criminal. His auto repair business carries significant debt, Mom continued. Equipment loans, commercial property, lease, liability insurance. He's basically one economic downturn away from bankruptcy. His parents' life insurance money went toward his sister's education rather than investments, Dad added. Poor financial planning that demonstrates questionable priorities. I stared at the documentation of Jake's life reduced to cold numbers and risk assessments. These people had taken everything beautiful about his sacrifice for his sister and twisted it into evidence of poor judgment. This is insane, I managed. You hired investigators to research the man I love. You've been secretly monitoring my bank accounts for a decade. We have one final offer, Roger said, pulling out his checkbook. Cancel this ridiculous venue, let us plan a reasonable wedding at our country club, and we'll cover all expenses, something appropriate for someone in your tax bracket. And if I refuse, then you're on your own financially, Linda said. No wedding assistance, no down payment help for a house, no safety net when this relationship inevitably fails. Amanda returned from her phone call looking pale and shaken. She glanced at my parents with an expression I couldn't quite read. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said carefully, but I need to speak with you, Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, about some complications regarding our venue ownership. My parents exchanged glances that seemed almost nervous. What kind of complications? Dad asked. Perhaps we should bring in our owner, Margaret, to explain, Amanda replied. She'll want to discuss this property situation immediately. Something in Amanda's tone made my skin prickle. The phone call had clearly revealed information that changed everything, and judging by my parents' sudden discomfort, they knew exactly what was coming. Margaret Chen appeared in the consultation room doorway like an elegant storm cloud. I'd met her briefly during my initial venue tour, but now she carried herself with barely controlled fury. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her navy suit suggested decades of successful business management, but her dark eyes blazed with betrayal. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, she said, her voice steady but deadly cold. How interesting to finally meet you in person. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Dad's typical arrogance faltered slightly as Margaret settled into the chair beside Amanda. I've just finished speaking with my attorney about the sale of this property, Margaret continued. Imagine my surprise to discover that the investment group that purchased Riverside Manor last month is owned by your firm, Mr. Hartwell. The blood drained from Roger's face. Margaret, I can explain. Can you? Her voice could have cut glass. Because I'm fascinated to understand how you failed to mention during this entire meeting that you personally orchestrated the sale of the venue your daughter booked for her wedding. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. What? Margaret turned to me with genuine sympathy. Christy, I'm afraid your parents bought this property through Hartwell Investment Group for $3.7 million. They plan to demolish the manor house and build luxury condominiums. The elegant room seemed to spin around me. My parents had secretly purchased my dream wedding venue with plans to destroy it completely. That's impossible, I whispered. I have the purchase agreements right here, Margaret said, pulling documents from her briefcase. Hartwell Investment Group, with Roger Hartwell as primary partner, closed on this property 4 weeks ago. The contract includes demolition permits and construction plans for a 40-unit luxury complex. Linda found her voice first. This is purely coincidental. We had no idea Christy had selected this particular venue when we made our investment. Really? Margaret's eyebrow arched skeptically. Because according to my records, Christy's booking was confirmed 8 months ago. Your purchase inquiry began 6 months ago, immediately after she put down her deposit. Roger tried to regain control of the situation. Margaret, you're making this sound more dramatic than necessary. This is a sound business investment. The property taxes alone were going to force you to sell within 5 years. Don't patronize me, Margaret snapped. I've operated this venue successfully for 22 years. Yes, the property taxes increased, and yes, my husband's medical bills from his cancer treatment created financial pressure. But you specifically targeted this property because of its emotional significance to local families. She pulled out another folder, this one containing correspondence that made my stomach turn. Your initial inquiry specifically mentioned that wedding venues represent emotional manipulation centers that exploit young women's unrealistic expectations. Margaret read from a printed email. You wrote that destroying these fairy tale locations would teach couples about financial reality. I stared at my parents in horror. They hadn't just bought my venue as a business investment, they deliberately targeted it to destroy other couples' dreams, along with mine. That's taken out of context, Dad protested weakly. Is it? Amanda spoke up, pulling out her own documentation. Because we've been contacted by 4 other wedding venues in the Denver area. All of them received similar aggressive purchase offers from your investment group in the past year. 3 have already been sold and demolished. My hands were shaking. You've been destroying wedding venues across the city. We're improving neighborhoods, Linda said defensively, replacing outdated buildings with modern housing that serves the community better. You're erasing history, Margaret said, her voice heavy with emotion. Riverside Manor was built in 1892 by James Riverside for his daughter's wedding. 4 generations of families have celebrated here. We've hosted over 2,000 weddings, anniversary parties, and family celebrations. She gestured toward the walls lined with photographs of happy couples spanning decades. This isn't just a business to me, Margaret continued. My late husband Richard and I restored this property with our own hands. We planted every rose in those gardens. We've watched babies we photographed at christenings return as brides 30 years later. That's very sentimental, Roger said dismissively. But sentiment doesn't pay property taxes or maintain aging infrastructure. Neither does demolishing every meaningful gathering place in Denver, Amanda interjected. Your firm has targeted specifically wedding venues and event spaces with historical significance. The Thornfield Barn Lakeside Gardens, Grandview Estate, all demolished for condos in the past 18 months. I thought about all the engaged couples who'd lost their dream venues to my parents' greed. How many women had stood exactly where I was standing, learning that their special day had been sacrificed to developers who viewed love as a commodity to exploit. There's one more thing, Margaret said quietly. The demolition permits your firm filed were submitted before the required historical impact studies were completed. Riverside Manor has been a state historical landmark for 3 years. Your purchase and planned destruction violate Colorado heritage protection laws. Roger and Linda exchanged panicked glances. That's impossible, Dad said. Our legal team reviewed everything. Did they? Margaret smiled grimly. Because I've been in contact with the Colorado Historical Crimes Unit, and they're very interested in discussing your firm's pattern of purchasing protected properties with intent to destroy them. Just then, Amanda's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and nodded to Margaret. Detective Morris is here, she announced. The consultation room door opened, and a woman in a dark suit with a badge on her belt stepped inside. Mr. and Mrs. Hartwell, Detective Patricia Morris said, "We need to talk." Detective Morris moved with calm authority as she entered the consultation room, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from family drama to criminal investigation. She was probably in her 40s with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my parents' increasingly panicked expressions. Roger and Linda Hartwell, she said, consulting a tablet in her hands, "You're both under investigation by the Colorado Historical Crimes Unit for conspiracy to destroy protected landmarks, fraud in real estate transactions, and violation of federal historic preservation acts." Mom's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. We're legitimate business investors." "Are you?" Detective Morris pulled up a chair, clearly prepared for a lengthy conversation. "Because we've been tracking your firm's activities for the past year, and the pattern suggests something far more deliberate than standard real estate investment." She turned to Margaret. Mrs. Chen, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your documentation has been invaluable. I stared between them, slowly understanding that this confrontation wasn't accidental. You've been working together, I asked. Margaret nodded gravely. When your parents' firm approached me with their purchase offer, something felt wrong. The price was too high, the timeline too aggressive, and their questions focused on how quickly the property could be demolished rather than its investment potential. Detective Morris opened a file folder filled with photographs and documents. Hartwell Investment Group has purchased 17 properties in Colorado over the past 3 years, she explained. 15 were historic buildings or landmarks. 14 have been demolished before proper heritage assessments could be completed. The pattern suggests intentional destruction of culturally significant properties. Dad tried to maintain his business demeanor. Detective, this is simply aggressive real estate development. Nothing illegal about purchasing properties and improving them. Except when those properties are protected by state and federal landmark designations, Detective Morris replied. Riverside Manor has been listed as a Colorado State Historical Landmark since 2022. Any structural modifications require approval from the State Historic Preservation Office. She pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. Your firm submitted demolition permits 6 weeks ago before completing required environmental and historical impact studies. You also failed to notify the State Historic Preservation Office of your intent to purchase a protected property. Those aren't oversights, Mr. Hartwell. They're deliberate attempts to circumvent legal protections. Linda finally spoke up, her lawyer instincts kicking in. We'll need to contact our attorney before answering any questions. Absolutely, you're right. Detective Morris agreed. But I should inform you that we've already interviewed employees from your firm who describe being pressured to expedite purchases of historic properties specifically to avoid preservation reviews. My heart pounded as the scope of my parents' criminal behavior became clear. They hadn't just invaded my privacy or destroyed my wedding plans. They'd been systematically targeting historic properties across Colorado. Amanda, I said suddenly, you're not really just a venue coordinator, are you? Amanda smiled apologetically. I'm actually a paralegal with the Denver District Attorney's Office. I've been working undercover to document your parents' pattern of targeting wedding venues and historic properties. The elaborate sting operation began making sense. My wedding booking had been used as evidence in a criminal investigation. The phone call earlier, I asked. My supervisor confirming that we had enough evidence to make arrests. Amanda explained. Your parents' behavior today, combined with their documented pattern of property destruction, gives us everything we need for prosecution. Detective Morris stood up, reaching for handcuffs on her belt. Roger Hartwell. Linda Hartwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to destroy protected landmarks, fraud in real estate transactions, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal historic preservation acts. This is insane, Dad protested. We're respected members of the Denver business community. Respected members don't bribe city planning officials to expedite demolition permits, Detective Morris replied calmly. We have recorded phone conversations, financial records, and testimony from 3 city employees who were offered cash payments to approve permits without proper review. As she read them their rights, I watched my parents' world collapse. The handcuffs clicked around Dad's wrists, and Mom's face went ashen as she realized the severity of their situation. Linda called as Detective Morris led them toward the door. This is all a misunderstanding. We were trying to protect you. Protect me from what? I asked, my voice hollow. From making the same mistakes we did, she said desperately. From thinking love is enough when the world requires money and status to survive. By destroying other people's dreams, by committing crimes, by teaching you reality, Roger said bitterly. But apparently you'd rather side with strangers than your own family. Detective Morris paused at the doorway. Christy, we'll need you to testify about your parents' behavior and their invasion of your financial privacy. Your testimony will help us seek justice for the dozens of families affected by their property destruction schemes. After they left, the consultation room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on Margaret's desk. I slumped into my chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. "I'm so sorry you had to experience this," Margaret said gently. "But your courage in standing up to them today will help protect other historic properties from similar destruction." "I didn't do anything courageous," I replied. "I just stood here while my parents destroyed their own lives." "You chose truth over family loyalty," Amanda said. "That's harder than most people realize." Margaret reached across the desk and squeezed my hand. "Christy, I want you to know that your wedding is still welcome at Riverside Manor. In fact, after what you've been through, I'd be honored to host your celebration at no charge. But the property sale will be voided due to the criminal violations," Detective Morris had explained before leaving. "Historic properties can't be legally purchased with intent to destroy their protected status." I looked around the beautiful consultation room where my parents had tried to destroy my future and instead destroyed their own. Justice was being served, but I felt hollow rather than victorious. Outside the tall windows, the Colorado mountains looked exactly the same as when I'd first visited Riverside Manor to plan the happiest day of my life. But everything else had changed forever. 3 days after my parents' arrest, I sat in a downtown Denver coffee shop across from prosecutor Jennifer Walsh and 5 other people I'd never met before. The morning sunshine streaming through windows felt surreal after the darkness of discovering my family's criminal behavior. "These are some of the families affected by your parents' property schemes," Jennifer explained, gesturing to the group assembled around our pushed-together tables. "I thought you should hear their stories." Sarah Phillips spoke first. She was about my age with kind eyes and a wedding ring that caught the light as she gestured. "Tom and I lost our dream venue 2 weeks before our wedding," she said quietly. "The Thornfield Barn had been in the same family for 90 years. Your parents' firm bought it and demolished it before we could find an alternative location." Her husband Tom nodded grimly. "We ended up getting married in a hotel conference room with fluorescent lights and carpet that smelled like industrial cleaner. Our wedding photos show folding chairs and a portable arch from the party supply store." "I'm so sorry," I whispered, feeling personally responsible for their ruined day. "It's not your fault," Sarah assured me, "but it helps to know that justice is finally being served." Maria Rodriguez, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair, spoke next. "My family owned Rodriguez's kitchen for 40 years, she said, her voice heavy with grief. "My grandparents met there in 1952 when it was still a corner diner. 3 generations of our family worked those tables." She pulled out her phone, showing photos of a warm restaurant with red vinyl booths and walls covered in family pictures. "Your mother's law firm found zoning loopholes that let your father's company buy our building out from under us. They claimed the neighborhood needed upscale dining options and demolished our restaurant for luxury condos. The condos have been sitting empty for 6 months," her son added bitterly. "They destroyed a community gathering place to build housing that people can't afford." Rabbi David Bernstein, an elderly man with a gentle demeanor, described losing his congregation's synagogue. "Temple Emmanuel had served our community since 1938, he said. "Your father's firm convinced our aging board that property taxes would force closure anyway. They bought the building for half its assessed value and demolished it within a week." "Where does your congregation meet now?" I asked. "The community center basement," he replied sadly. 65 years of history gone. Torah scrolls that survived the Holocaust-stained glass windows donated by families who fled persecution, memorial plaques for 3 generations of our dead, all buried in a construction dumpster. Each story felt like a knife to my heart. My parents hadn't just destroyed buildings, they'd erased community memories and family heritage for profit. Jennifer Walsh leaned forward. "Christy, these families deserve justice, but we need your testimony to establish the pattern of deliberate cruelty in your parents' business practices." "What do you mean?" Your parents' private communications reveal that they specifically targeted properties with high emotional value, Jennifer explained. They weren't just developing real estate, they were deliberately destroying places that held meaning for families and communities. She showed me printed emails between my parents discussing teaching lessons about financial reality by eliminating sentimentality-based businesses. This is evidence of psychological manipulation designed to cause maximum emotional damage, Jennifer continued. Your testimony about their behavior toward your wedding plans will help establish their pattern of using family relationships to inflict harm. The moral weight of the decision pressed down on me. Testifying would mean permanently destroying any chance of reconciliation with my parents, but staying silent would deny justice to dozens of families they'd harmed. What about Jake? I asked. How has this affected him? Jennifer's expression softened. He's been incredibly supportive throughout the investigation. He wants me to tell you that whatever you decide, he'll stand by you. That evening, Jake and I sat on the front porch of his small house watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains orange and gold. He held my hand while I struggled with the impossible choice between family loyalty and moral responsibility. I found something out today, Jake said quietly, about my hometown in Kansas. What? Remember the auto repair shop where I worked summers during high school? My dad's friend owned it. I nodded, remembering his stories about learning to rebuild engines there. It was demolished 3 years ago by a development company, Jake continued. I called to ask about it after hearing your parents' story. Guess who was the silent partner in that development deal? My heart sank. No? Hartwell Investment Group, Jake confirmed. They bought every small business on that block and demolished them all for strip mall chain stores. My parents used to get their cars serviced there. It was where my dad taught me to change oil and check brake pads. Jake, I'm so sorry. Don't apologize for them, he said firmly. But now you know this isn't just about your wedding or even Denver properties. They've been destroying communities across multiple states. How do you not hate me for being related to them? Jake turned to face me, his hands cupping my cheeks gently. Because you're not them, he said. You chose to work for a children's nonprofit instead of pursuing corporate law like your mother wanted. You saved your own money for our wedding instead of expecting them to pay. You're horrified by their behavior instead of defending it. But they're still my parents. And they made choices that hurt innocent people, Jake replied. Love doesn't require enabling cruelty. 2 days later, I called Jennifer Walsh. I'll testify, I told her. These families deserve justice. Are you sure once you take the stand, there's no going back to family relationships the way they were? I thought about Sarah and Tom's wedding in a sterile conference room, about Maria's family restaurant reduced to rubble, about Rabbi Bernstein's congregation mourning 65 years of history. Those relationships were built on lies and control anyway, I realized. Maybe it's time to choose truth instead. Margaret called that same afternoon. Christy, I've been thinking about your situation, she said. Would you consider letting Riverside Manor host your wedding at no charge after your courage in seeking justice for our community? It would be an honor. Margaret, I can't accept that. Please, she insisted. Your parents tried to destroy this place to teach you that love doesn't matter as much as money. Let's prove them wrong by showing that love and community support are stronger than greed. Are you sure? Completely sure, Margaret said warmly. Your wedding will be a celebration of justice triumphing over manipulation. I can't think of anything more meaningful to host here. That night, Jake and I began planning our wedding celebration with a completely different perspective. Instead of proving we could afford expensive things, we were celebrating the community that had supported us through impossible circumstances. Whatever happens at the trial, Jake said, we'll face it together. Together, I agreed, finally understanding that family isn't just about blood relations. Sometimes it's about choosing people who support your growth instead of demanding your compliance. 4 months later, the Colorado District Courthouse buzzed with activity as photographers and reporters gathered outside for the high-profile heritage destruction trial. Inside courtroom C, I sat in the front row wearing a simple navy dress, my engagement ring catching the overhead lights as I twisted it nervously around my finger. Jake squeezed my hand as we watched my parents enter through the side door with their defense attorneys. Mom looked pale and thin in an expensive gray suit, while Dad seemed to have aged years in the months since his arrest. Neither of them looked in my direction. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hernandez," the bailiff announced. Judge Hernandez was a stern woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see straight through legal maneuvering to underlying truth. She'd built her reputation on holding white-collar criminals accountable for their actions. "We're here today for the case of the people of Colorado versus Roger James Hartwell and Linda Marie Hartwell," she began. "The defendants stand accused of conspiracy to destroy protected landmarks, fraud in real estate transactions, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal historic preservation acts." Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh stood to deliver her opening statement. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendants engaged in a deliberate, systematic campaign to destroy historic properties across Colorado for personal profit, showing callous disregard for community heritage and federal law." She gestured toward a display board covered with photographs of demolished buildings. 15 historic properties, 14 unlawfully demolished, dozens of families devastated, millions of dollars in profits built on the destruction of irreplaceable cultural landmarks. Defense attorney Robert Manning countered with claims about legitimate business development and regulatory confusion, but his arguments felt weak against the mountain of evidence Jennifer had assembled. "The prosecution calls Christy Marie Hartwell to the stand," Jennifer announced. My legs felt unsteady as I walked to the witness stand past my parents' table where Mom stared straight ahead with practiced composure. Dad looked defeated already. "Please state your relationship to the defendants," Jennifer began after I'd been sworn in. "Roger and Linda Hartwell are my parents." I said, my voice clearer than I'd expected. "Can you describe the incident at Riverside Manor on March 15th of this year?" I took a deep breath and began recounting that devastating day, describing my parents' public humiliation tactics and their demands that the venue coordinator cancel my wedding booking. "Did your parents give any explanation for their behavior?" "They claimed I couldn't afford the venue and that they were protecting me from financial irresponsibility," I replied. But their real motivation became clear when we learned they had secretly purchased the property with plans to demolish it. Jennifer introduced evidence of my parents' financial surveillance, showing the court-printed copies of my bank statements that they'd obtained without authorization. "How long had your parents been monitoring your private financial information?" "Over 10 years, I answered. "They used an old joint account from when I was 17 to track every aspect of my financial life without my knowledge or consent." "Did they use this information to control your behavior?" "Yes. They knew about every purchase, every bill payment, every financial decision. They used that information to manipulate my relationships and undermine my independence." The most damaging evidence came next. Jennifer played audio recordings of my parents' private phone conversations captured through court-authorized surveillance during the investigation. "Listen to this conversation between the defendants recorded on March 10th of this year," Jennifer announced. My mother's voice filled the courtroom. "These ridiculous wedding venues are emotional manipulation centers. Young girls waste money on fairy tale fantasies instead of learning practical realities about marriage." Dad's response was even worse. "Destroying these places teaches them valuable lessons. Marriage isn't about pretty dresses and flower arrangements. It's about financial planning and social status." One more wedding venue bought and demolished. Mom continued with audible satisfaction. "That's 3 couples this month who'll have more realistic celebrations." The courtroom was silent as the implications sank in. My parents hadn't just been developing real estate. They'd been deliberately targeting wedding venues to destroy other couples' celebrations. "Did your parents ever explicitly state their intention to target wedding venues specifically?" Jennifer asked. "Yes," I replied, my voice steady despite my broken heart. They kept journals documenting their property purchases, including comments about correcting young couples, entitled Attitudes, by forcing them to have more realistic weddings. Jennifer presented the journals as evidence. Page after page of my parents' handwriting described their satisfaction in disrupting wedding plans and forcing couples to settle for appropriate venues that matched their actual social status. What was your reaction to discovering this evidence? Horror, I said simply. I realized my parents had been systematically destroying the happiest days of other people's lives for their own psychological satisfaction. Defense attorney Manning tried to undermine my credibility during cross-examination, suggesting I was a disgruntled daughter seeking revenge for childhood disappointments. "Isn't it true that you resented your parents' financial success?" he asked. "No," I replied firmly. I resented their use of that success to hurt innocent people. "You chose to work for a nonprofit instead of pursuing lucrative career options. Doesn't that suggest rejection of your parents' values?" "It suggests I wanted to help children instead of destroying communities," I answered. I'm proud of that choice. Manning's strategy backfired when he tried to portray my parents as concerned about my financial welfare. "Your parents were simply trying to prevent you from making expensive mistakes, weren't they? By committing federal crimes and destroying historic landmarks?" I asked. "By targeting other families' meaningful celebrations. That's not parental concern. That's deliberate cruelty." The prosecution called Margaret Chen next, and her testimony devastated the defense case. She described 20 years of hosting celebrations at Riverside Manor, the community connections built through her venue, and the emotional impact of my parents' threats to destroy everything she'd built. "This property represents more than a business," Margaret said, her voice strong but emotional. "Couples who married here 30 years ago bring their children for family photos in the same gardens. We've hosted memorial services for community leaders, charity fundraisers for local nonprofits, and anniversary celebrations that span generations." She pulled out a photo album filled with decades of celebrations. The defendants didn't just want to demolish a building. They wanted to erase a gathering place that holds 40 years of community memories. Detective Patricia Morris testified about the broader pattern of heritage destruction, showing evidence of my parents' involvement in demolishing historic properties across 3 states. The defendants specifically targeted properties with high emotional or cultural significance, she explained. Churches, synagogues, family restaurants, wedding venues, places where communities gathered to celebrate important moments. The financial evidence was staggering. My parents' investment group had profited over $15 million from heritage destruction schemes, paying bribes totaling nearly $500,000 to city officials who expedited demolition permits. This wasn't random real estate development, Detective Morris concluded. This was systematic destruction of community gathering places designed to maximize both profit and emotional damage. On the final day of testimony, my parents' former employees provided the most damning evidence. 3 people who'd worked for Hartwell Investment Group described being pressured to target properties with sentimental value specifically. Mr. Hartwell told us to look for venues where families held meaningful celebrations, testified former researcher Timothy Brooks. He said destroying those places would teach people not to waste money on emotional nonsense. Mrs. Hartwell provided legal strategies for circumventing heritage protection laws, added paralegal Susan Martinez. She specifically researched ways to demolish historic properties before preservation orders could be filed. As the trial concluded, I watched my parents sitting rigidly at their defense table, still refusing to show remorse for the communities they'd destroyed or the families they'd harmed. Judge Hernandez scheduled sentencing for the following week, but the verdict was already clear in everyone's faces. Justice was finally coming for the families whose meaningful places had been sacrificed to greed and deliberate cruelty. That evening, Jake and I walked through downtown Denver past construction sites where historic buildings had once stood. The empty lots felt like missing teeth in the city's smile, permanent reminders of what had been lost to developers who valued profit over community heritage. "Do you think they'll ever understand what they did?" Jake asked. "I don't think they want to understand," I replied. "Understanding would require admitting that other people's feelings matter more than their own financial gain." "Are you okay with how everything turned out?" I thought about that question as we continued walking. My parents would likely spend years in prison. My extended family blamed me for betraying them. But dozens of families had received justice, and future historic properties would be protected by stronger laws inspired by this case. "I'm okay with choosing truth over family loyalty," I said, finally. "Some things are more important than keeping family secrets." The sentencing hearing took place on a crisp October morning with golden aspen leaves visible through the courthouse windows. Judge Hernandez had reviewed thousands of pages of evidence, victim impact statements, and character references before making her final decision. "Roger James Hartwell," she announced, "you are sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy to destroy protected landmarks, fraud in real estate transactions, and bribery of public officials." Dad's legs buckled slightly as the bailiff moved toward him. 8 years. He'd be 67 when he was released his investment firm, long since dissolved, and his reputation permanently destroyed. "Linda Marie Hartwell, you are sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for conspiracy legal malpractice, in facilitating heritage destruction, and violation of federal historic preservation acts." Mom maintained her composure, but I saw her hands trembling as she gripped the defendant's table. "Additionally," Judge Hernandez continued, "both defendants are ordered to pay restitution totaling $15.3 million to affected families and heritage restoration projects across Colorado." The financial penalty would bankrupt my parents completely. Their mansion, vacation homes, investment accounts, everything would be liquidated to compensate the families they'd harmed. This court has rarely seen such callous disregard for community heritage and deliberate cruelty disguised as business practices. Judge Hernandez said, her voice heavy with disgust. The defendants systematically destroyed irreplaceable community gathering places while showing complete indifference to the emotional devastation they caused to dozens of families. She looked directly at my parents with undisguised contempt. "Your crimes represent more than fraud or regulatory violations. You weaponized wealth and legal expertise to erase community memories and family traditions for personal profit. The historic properties you destroyed can never be restored. The celebrations you ruined can never be recreated. The trust you violated in your own family relationships demonstrates a level of psychological manipulation that this court finds particularly disturbing." As my parents were led away in handcuffs, Mom finally looked at me across the courtroom. Her expression wasn't apologetic or remorseful. It was angry, as if I'd betrayed her, rather than sought justice for her victims. "You've destroyed your own family," she mouthed silently. "No," I whispered back. "You did." The immediate aftermath brought unexpected consequences. Colorado passed the Heritage Protection Act within 6 months, requiring triple damages for illegal destruction of landmark properties and mandatory prison sentences for heritage crimes. 3 other states introduced similar legislation after national media coverage of my parents' case. The story sparked federal investigations into heritage destruction schemes in 12 additional states. The FBI discovered that my parents' tactics had been copied by developers across the country, leading to hundreds of protected properties being illegally demolished. Margaret called me 2 weeks after sentencing with incredible news. Christie the state is providing $300,000 in heritage preservation grants to restore and maintain Riverside Manor. She announced tearfully, "Your parents' crimes ironically secured the venue's future for generations." "That's wonderful, Margaret." "There's more," she continued. "The restitution money is funding a heritage protection foundation that will help other historic venues upgrade their facilities and legal protections. Riverside Manor will be headquarters for the new Colorado Community Heritage Foundation. The wedding planning that had been interrupted by my parents' arrest resumed with unexpected community support. Local vendors offered services at cost to show solidarity with our fight for justice. The photographer who documented the trial donated her services. The florist whose great-grandmother had planted roses at Riverside Manor insisted on providing arrangements for free. "This isn't just your wedding anymore," Margaret explained as we planned the celebration. "It's become a symbol of community resilience against developers who try to erase local heritage." Our guest list grew beyond family and friends to include the families who'd been affected by my parents' crimes. Sarah and Tom Phillips would be there along with Maria Rodriguez and Rabbi Bernstein. Detective Morris planned to attend, and Judge Hernandez sent a congratulatory note expressing her hope that our celebration would help heal the community damage my parents had caused. 6 months after the trial, on a perfect May afternoon with Colorado mountains gleaming under cloudless skies, Jake and I were married in Margaret's restored rose gardens. The ceremony included a moment of silence for all the landmarks and venues destroyed by greed-driven developers, followed by readings about community strength and choosing justice over convenience. Margaret walked me down the aisle, having become the mother figure my biological parents never truly were. She'd spent hours listening to my struggles with guilt and family loyalty, helping me understand that love sometimes requires setting boundaries against those who harm others. Jake's vows included promises to always support my courage in standing up for what's right, even when it comes at personal cost. My vows promised to choose truth over comfortable lies and community welfare over family pressure. "Do you take this woman to be your wife, knowing that she has the strength to choose justice even when it means personal sacrifice?" the minister asked Jake. "I do," Jake replied, his eyes bright with pride. "Her courage is one of the reasons I fell in love with her." "Do you take this man to be your husband, knowing that he will support your moral convictions, even when they complicate your life?" "I do," I answered. "His integrity matches my own." The reception featured speeches from families whose venues had been saved by the new heritage protection laws. Maria Rodriguez announced that she was opening a new restaurant in a historic building protected by the legislation inspired by our case. The Rodriguez family is back in business, she declared to applause, and this time, developers can't touch us. Rabbi Bernstein shared news that his congregation had purchased and restored a 19th century church building, creating an interfaith community center that would serve multiple religious groups. "From destruction comes renewal," he said. "From hatred comes understanding. From greed comes laws that protect what communities hold sacred." Margaret's toast brought tears to everyone's eyes. Christy and Jake's love story began with two people choosing each other despite family opposition, she said. It continued with their choice to seek justice, despite personal cost. Today, their marriage represents triumph of authentic love over manipulation, community support, over family control and moral courage, over convenient silence. As we danced our first dance to acoustic guitar music provided by local musicians whose venue had been saved by our testimony, I realized that losing my parents' approval had freed me to gain something far more valuable, the respect of a community that had watched me choose truth over loyalty. The evening concluded with photographs in the same rose gardens where my parents had tried to destroy my dreams. Instead of the sterile hotel conference room that Sarah and Tom had endured, we were surrounded by historic beauty that would be protected for future generations. Jake and I spent our honeymoon visiting historic venues across America that had been successfully protected by community activism. We met couples who'd fought developers, preservationists who'd saved landmarks, and local leaders who'd chosen heritage over profit. "Look what we started," Jake said as we toured a restored train depot in Vermont that now hosted weddings and community events. "Look what courage can accomplish when people decide to fight back," I corrected. We returned to Denver, committed to expanding our advocacy work. Using the speaking fees from our story, we established the Community Heritage Defense Fund, providing legal assistance to local groups fighting developers who target meaningful properties. 6 months later, our nonprofit had helped save 4 historic venues from demolition and supported passage of heritage protection laws in 2 additional states. Our story inspired other families to investigate suspicious property development in their own communities. The personal healing took longer than the legal victories. I underwent months of therapy to process the betrayal of discovering my parents' criminal behavior and their decade-long invasion of my privacy. Learning to trust my own judgment after years of manipulation required professional guidance and tremendous patience from Jake. Your parents taught you that love comes with conditions, my therapist, Dr. Amanda Foster, explained. You're learning that healthy love supports growth rather than demanding compliance. The most difficult moments came during holidays and family celebrations when I felt the absence of parents who'd chosen greed over their daughter's happiness. But those moments were balanced by the knowledge that their convictions were protecting communities from similar destruction. My extended family initially blamed me for betraying Roger and Linda, but as more evidence emerged about their crimes, some relatives began expressing private support for my testimony. My cousin Jennifer attended our first anniversary celebration, quietly mentioning that she'd always suspected something wasn't right about my parents' business practices. "You did what needed to be done," she told me. We were all too scared to question them. 3 years later, Jake and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Hope Margaret Sullivan, honoring both our optimism for the future and the woman who'd supported us through impossible circumstances. Margaret became an honorary grandmother, delighting in pushing Hope's stroller through the rose gardens where our love story had nearly been destroyed. "She'll grow up knowing that communities can fight back against greed," Margaret said, bouncing Hope on her knee during Sunday dinners at Riverside Manor. "That ordinary people can choose justice even when it costs them everything." Our daughter would never know her biological grandparents, but she'd be surrounded by a chosen family built on shared values of integrity, community service, and moral courage. The criminal behavior that destroyed my birth family had ultimately created something stronger, a network of relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. The Heritage Protection Act, inspired by our case, has now saved over 40 historic properties across Colorado, with similar legislation pending in 8 additional states. The Community Heritage Defense Fund has grown into a regional organization providing legal support to preservation efforts throughout the Mountain West. My parents remain in federal prison serving their sentences with minimal family contact. They've shown no remorse for their crimes or acknowledgement of the communities they damaged. During the few phone conversations I've accepted, they continue claiming they were unfairly targeted for legitimate business practices. "You chose strangers over your own family," Mom said during our last conversation. "I chose justice over criminal behavior," I replied. "There's a difference." "We gave you everything: education opportunities, financial security. You gave me conditional love that required me to enable your cruelty toward others," I corrected. "I chose authentic relationships instead." That conversation convinced me to maintain permanent boundaries with my parents. Love shouldn't require accepting others' criminal behavior or staying silent about community harm. Jake and I recently purchased our first home, a small craftsman bungalow built in 1923 that we're restoring with period-appropriate materials. Our neighbors include 3 other couples whose weddings were saved by the heritage protection laws, creating a block full of families committed to community preservation over individual profit. "Sometimes losing toxic family members makes room for healthier relationships," Jake observed as we planted heirloom roses in our backyard garden. "Sometimes choosing justice over loyalty opens doors to authentic love." I agreed. Our story continues inspiring others facing similar choices between family pressure and moral convictions. I speak regularly at conferences about financial abuse, family manipulation, and the courage required to seek justice against those we're supposed to love unconditionally. Unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional acceptance of harmful behavior, I tell audiences. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is hold people accountable for their choices. The question I'm asked most frequently is whether I regret destroying my relationship with my parents for the sake of strangers' wedding venues. But those strangers became friends, their communities became my community, and their fight for justice became the foundation of my adult identity. I regret that my parents chose crime over integrity. I always answer. But I'll never regret choosing truth over comfortable lies. 5 years after that devastating day in Margaret's consultation room, Jake and I return to Riverside Manor every spring to celebrate our anniversary. We walk through rose gardens that my parents tried to destroy past venues that now host hundreds of celebrations each year under aspen trees that will shelter future generations of couples choosing love over fear. The manor house displays a small plaque near the front entrance, Saved by Community Action and Individual Courage 2025, in memory of all heritage properties lost to greed and in honor of those who fight to preserve what communities hold sacred. Margaret often joins us for those anniversary walks, sharing stories about couples who've celebrated in spaces my parents tried to eliminate. Her favorite story involves a young woman whose great-grandmother was married at Riverside Manor in 1958, creating a century-spanning connection that would have been lost forever if developers had succeeded in their demolition plans. Your parents thought destroying beautiful places would teach people that love isn't worth celebrating, Margaret reflected during one such walk. Instead, their crimes taught communities to fight harder for what they value most. That lesson extends far beyond wedding venues or historic preservation. It's about recognizing manipulation disguised as concern, choosing authentic relationships over convenient lies, and understanding that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are the ones trying to control us most completely. Our daughter Hope is now 3 years old enough to help tend the roses in our garden, and young enough to believe that fairy tales come true. She doesn't know yet about the grandparents in prison or the family wealth sacrificed to justice. She only knows that communities support each other, that beautiful places deserve protection, and that her parents' love comes without conditions or manipulation. Will you tell her the whole story someday? Jake asked recently as we watched Hope chase butterflies in Margaret's gardens. When she's old enough to understand that choosing justice sometimes costs everything and gives back even more, I replied. When she needs to know that love should empower growth, not demand compliance. And if she faces similar choices about family loyalty versus moral courage, then she'll know her parents chose truth over convenience and found happiness in communities that supported their values rather than demanded their silence. The final irony of our story is that my parents' attempt to destroy my wedding ultimately created the most meaningful celebration possible. Instead of a ceremony about expensive decorations and social status, our wedding became a community affirmation of justice, courage, and love that builds rather than controls. Every couple married at Riverside Manor since our case has heard some version of our story. They know their celebration takes place in gardens, saved by a daughter who chose community justice over family loyalty. Their wedding photos include roses planted with restitution money paid by criminals who thought beautiful places weren't worth protecting. Do you think they were right about anything? Jake asked during our recent 5th anniversary celebration. About practical marriage considerations or financial responsibility? They were right that marriage requires practical planning and financial maturity. I acknowledged. They were wrong about everything else. Love isn't a weakness to be cured through cruelty. Beauty isn't manipulation to be eliminated through destruction. Community celebrations aren't frivolous expenses to be mocked by people with more money than empathy. As I finish sharing this story, I'm sitting in the same consultation room where my parents tried to destroy my dreams and ended up destroying their own freedom instead. Margaret has converted this space into the Colorado Community Heritage Foundation office, where couples learn about protecting meaningful venues and communities organize against destructive development. The walls display photographs of historic properties saved through community activism, including dozens of venues protected by legislation inspired by our case. There are thank you letters from couples whose celebrations were preserved newspaper articles about heritage victories across multiple states and legal documents establishing the Heritage Protection Fund that continues growing through restitution payments from heritage crimes. But my favorite display is a simple photo album showing weddings hosted at Riverside Manor since our story began. Page after page of couples celebrating in gardens, my parents tried to eliminate creating new memories in spaces that criminal greed couldn't destroy. Their faces glow with the same joy Jake and I felt on our wedding day, proving that love and community support are stronger than manipulation and control. Their celebrations honor not just their own relationships, but the courage of everyone who fights to preserve what communities value most. Looking back, I understand that my parents' greatest crime wasn't violating heritage protection laws or bribing public officials. Their greatest crime was believing that beauty, meaning, and community joy were luxuries that ordinary people didn't deserve to experience or protect. They were wrong. Beauty matters. Meaning matters. Community celebrations matter. Love that builds rather than controls matters more than wealth that destroys rather than creates. Sometimes protecting what matters most requires courage to stand against those who should support us unconditionally. Sometimes justice demands sacrifice of relationships we thought we needed to maintain. Sometimes the family we choose becomes more loving than the family we're born into. But when we make those difficult choices with integrity and community support, we discover that truth really can set us free. Love really can triumph over manipulation, and ordinary people really can fight back against those who try to destroy what gives life meaning and joy. What would you do if you discovered your own family was systematically destroying other people's dreams for profit? Have you ever faced a choice between family loyalty and moral courage? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if our story resonated with your own experiences with family manipulation. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about choosing justice over convenience and building authentic relationships based on respect rather than control. Share this video with anyone who might need encouragement to stand up for what's right, even when it costs them everything they thought they needed to keep. Thank you for listening to our journey from family betrayal to community healing. Remember that love should empower your growth, not demand your silence, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is choose truth over comfortable lies. Until next time, keep fighting for what makes life beautiful, meaningful, and worth celebrating.